Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and in this next set of videos, what I'm doing is that if you've been watching my 2022 Intro to Express videos, what I did is I built a Sodas app, and that Sodas app was built using just Express. Okay, so no database, so there was no way to really save the data between you turning off the app. So every time you turned off the app and you turned it back on, all the data was back to where it started. Okay, because bottom line, with any application you create programming wise, okay, the program only runs in memory. Okay, so just to kind of clarify what that means is that you have memory, the RAM in your computer, that is used to store things while the program is running. But once the program is done running, that gets cleared out. Okay, so generally, if you want things to be saved after the program is closed, they have to be written outside of the application on disk. Okay, so basically on a hard drive. And you could write it to a file, like a CSV file or a JSON file or whatnot. That is totally fine. But typically, when you're talking about large amounts of data, you're going to have programs that kind of manage that. They're called databases. They can manage data on one or more computers. How they write the data to the disk, you don't know. All you know is that I can interact with this piece of software, and it's going to keep my data in a persistent way, meaning it'll exist whether my application is off or on. And again, one way to think about it is like a PlayStation memory card. Back when you had like memory cards for like PlayStation, Nintendo 64. Like if you didn't actually have a PlayStation memory card in your Sony PlayStation, you wouldn't be able to save your game, and then any progress you made while when you turn off your PlayStation would be lost. Same idea. Okay, so your database is essentially your memory card for your application, so you can save your application, so that way your application doesn't have to start over every time it turns on and off. Okay, or when someone logs on and off, or anytime you're kind of creating a new session. So that's what we're going to do today. What we're going to do is we're going to use one type of database called which is referred to as a NoSQL database. NoSQL is really more of a big catch-all category. So there's a bunch of different NoSQL databases, and they can all work very differently. But the idea is that they're not relational databases. They don't depend on SQL and relations. So more specifically, MongoDB, the database we'll be working with, is what's called a document database. And document databases, typically what they do is they save data as documents. Okay, which is different than a record in a traditional database. So a traditional relational database, an SQL database, saves data in columns and rows. So think of it like an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so essentially each column represents a like color, height, name, and then each row would represent like one person. Okay, the way a document database generally does it saves each piece of information as just a big string. Typically, like in MongoDB's case, it saves them more like in a JSON format, a special JSON format called BSON, but same idea. And so essentially what you're doing is you're just saving strings. So there's no like intrinsic relationship, like the database doesn't track relationships between these unique pieces of data. You just have a bunch of strings, and basically any kind of relationship between the data is really kind of, you would have to then program into your application. But the benefit is the database can operate a lot faster when it saves the data in that format and organizes it in that way, because it's not having to do all this extra work that the relationships provide. So it's great for speed. Okay. But also the great thing about Mongo is that it's actually pretty easy to use. Okay, so if you haven't watched my videos on Mongo, probably not a bad idea to watch those first. So like watch my sort of like Mongo masterclass video or Mongoose masterclass video. That'll be a good introduction to sort of all the pieces. I will talk to them as I go through, but this is not necessarily a introduction to Mongo. Okay, but generally the first thing we're going to want to do is you're going to want to head over to mongodb.com. I am going to assume that you have an account. If not, you're going to go to try free, and then you can create an account. You can sign up, or you can sign in with Google. Create an account in a lot of different ways. Okay. Once all that is done, and what I'll do is I'll go through the process and create another account. Why not? Okay. So what I'll do is I will create an account. So we'll just say Alex Merced, we'll just call this November 2022 at AlexMerced.com. Okay, and then I will put in a password. Okay, cool. I agree, and let's create my account. Okay, so that's going to create my account. Sure. Okay, it's going to send the notification email, so I'm going to go open up into different tabs. I'm going to pause this video and take care of that. I'll be right back. Okay, so once your email is verified, then you'll get to this screen right here. So I will hit continue. It's going to take me start generating my new account. Okay, and there's going to be several steps just for the initial setup. It's actually pretty straightforward, but it's not like, you know, snap your fingers quick. Okay, so basically, again, you can answer these questions however you want. I'm just learn MongoDB, what type of applications are you building, um, other, just practice hobby apps. Okay, what is my preferred language? Again, none of these questions really matter. They're just for their own internal collection because, like any company, they want to know kind of who are the people using the product so that way they can better market the product. So, they see, oh, okay, it's a lot of JavaScript people who are using the using Mongo, so we should market more towards them. Or there's not as many Python people, so maybe we have some more room to grow by marketing towards Python developers, that kind of thing. Okay, so again, I wouldn't worry about that. Okay, so now you have these options. We are going to want to go with the free option because we are just learning Mongo. Although you have these really cool other options. Okay, so this would be like a dedicated server where you actually get your own dedicated compute. You do have to pay for that. And when I say compute, it means like there's a virtual computer that's merely running your database and nothing else. Okay, we're going to be using shared, which means Mongo has all these virtual servers that are running databases for lots of people. Okay, so basically the performance is shared with other people, but because of that, we can use it for free. Then there's serverless, which is a really cool concept. The idea is that there is no computer. There is like, instead what happens is that the data is stored somewhere, and essentially the the actual like server is just there's just like this like invisible server that Mongo runs that we send requests to, and it'll fish out our data without us having to worry about having a constantly running server. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's also a little bit simpler than that. But it's a really cool concept, and it's actually it can be a lot cheaper depending on how you architect your app. But for practicing, you can't beat free. Okay. So again, we want that shared. Honestly, generally, it's gonna kind of always default to like the best defaults. So, leave that. Like that's the cluster name. Again, everything is good. So then once we're done, again, make sure it's the free tier, and then just hit create cluster. Okay. Once we create cluster, that's about it. It's gonna ask us to create an initial user. Okay. I will create this initial user real quick. Okay, so you will do the same. So create an initial user name and password, and I'll see you on the other side. Once you've created your user, like the next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to head over to this section called database. Okay, what we're going to see here is you're going to see that you have a cluster that's currently kind of spinning up. Shouldn't take too long. Okay, but it's going to take a few minutes for this to kind of become live. So you see it says loading. Just give that a minute. But what we can do in the meantime is we start setting up some of the stuff we need to set up. And just to kind of understand the layout here, essentially in Mongo you have organizations. So organizations are like an organization. So basically like your company, or you might have your own private organization, or you might work on an app with some other friends, and you create an organization for that app, for that organization. Now that organization may have multiple projects. Okay, so you see here I'm starting off with this project 0, but I could go in there and I can add a new project. Now each project can have multiple databases. So this free cluster, I can get one per project. Although honestly, if you're new to this, having only one project, one organization, and one cluster is all you will really need. Okay, that one database can really do everything you need for all your practice projects. Okay, so I wouldn't even really worry about it. But just so you can understand, like if you wanted to, you could create multiple projects, and each of those projects can get a free cluster. But really, honestly, one cluster does the job at this level where you're just practicing. Okay. There's a bunch of other really cool features like data lake. I haven't played with that yet. Project level data sets stored in columnar cloud object storage for fast. Okay, so this is like an analytics platform in Mongo, so that way it stores the data in a way. When I say like columnar data sets, it just means like generally when you're doing analytics versus like an application. In applications, you want to store the data in a more row-based format. Generally in analytics, you want to store it in a columnar format because it's going to be better for the types of queries or types of questions you're going to ask the database. So this is just basically setting that up. I spend me personally, like my job literally during the day is to work with data lakes. So this speaks to my heart. Okay, here we have other types of services like data API. So like you can actually, cool thing about Mongo is that you can actually use it straight as your backend. You don't necessarily have to create a backend app. You can actually, it'll generate an API to the database for you, and then your front end can just talk directly to that API. It's a cool feature, not what I'm going to go over today, but you have these kind of cool features like that. What we do care about is access to our database. Most importantly, network access. Okay, and here what we're going to do is you want to make sure that all IP addresses are allowed. So see this, allow access from anywhere. Why? Because eventually you're going to want to deploy your app. And you don't know what the IP address for the server you have when you're using a service like a Render or Railway or Fly.io or Heroku to deploy your application. So you want to make sure that wherever your application is running, they can talk to the database. Okay, and we'll just confirm that. Okay, and again, if you want to allow like your ideal world when you're building like a production level app, you'd only really want to let you would actually set up a specific computer, like a specific virtual computer with a specific IP address to run your application, and you would only want that server to talk to this application. So you could set up more specific IP addresses. But again, right now this is just practice. Allow access from anywhere. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we need to have data. We're going to create another. I'm going to create another user. You could use the user you created. I'm going to create another user so that way you can kind of see me walk through the process. So I'm going to create another database user. We're just going to call it, cheese as the username, cheese as the password. Let me just make sure that's cheese twice. Good. And then I'm going to add a built-in role of Atlas admin. Okay, so that way it can just access anything. Again, this is going to be a temporary role. So see, I'm going to click here, set temporary user. I want to set this up for 6 hours. So 6 hours from now, this user will not exist. So if you're watching this video, you can't use my username and password to access my stuff. Okay, and then I'm going to add that user. Cool. Okay, so that's the two main things I need. I need a user, and I need to make sure that all IP addresses are allowed. And then I go back over here. I'm going to check to see if and look, everything is up and running. So we are good. So the next step is I'm going to need my URL. Okay, and we're going to come back to that. First, I'm going to go back to VS Code and start setting up my basic Express app. So I'm going to go to the terminal. And I'm going to first create a server.js, touch server.js. Then I am going to do an npm init-y to create my package.json. Good. And then in my package.json, I want to make sure I make my scripts. So node server.js, that works. And then dev nodamon server.js. Okay, and that's good for me for now. And now we're going to install stuff. So npm I, so I'm going to install Express EJS because we're going to be using EJS as a templating library. I'm going to want to install method override because we'll need that eventually. We're going to want to install Morgan for logging. We're going to want to install Mongoose for connecting to our Mongo database. We're going to want to install .env for using .env variables. And I think that should do it. Okay, so I'm going to let that run. That's going to be installing everything. And we should see everything kind of added to our package.json. So there we go. So we see all these dependencies disappeared. So that means everything got installed just fine. And the next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to create two files, a .getignore file and a .env file. Okay, the .getignore file is to make sure that certain things don't get committed to Git because we're going to stash all of our secret information in that .env file. So we don't want that on GitHub. So, and then the /node modules folder, there's no need for you to push that to GitHub. That's just like a lot of files. You're just wasting a lot of space. So we want to not commit that to GitHub. Okay, so I put those two things there and we should be good to go. And then in the .env, we can put any variables that we'd like to put. Like, we might want to define a port variable. So we'll say, hey, Let's do this on port 333. And then I want to define my Mongo URI. And again, it doesn't matter what you call the variable. I'm going to call it Mongo URI. You can call it whatever you want. MongoDB URL, Mongo URL, database URL. Actually, let's go with database URL because that's very typical. Keep it consistent. Okay, so that's going to be the variable that holds our database URL. And again, the reason you want this ignored, because again, you don't want this on GitHub. And then what you would do is generally anywhere you deploy it, there's going to be a place where you can define these environmental variables, and you would define it on the platform you deploy to. And then locally you would have the .env file. So to get that URL, we're going to click on connect, and I am connecting my application. Where's the application one? Database, less API, MongoDB drivers, MongoDB Compass. Oh yeah, connect your application. There we go. Okay, they changed it. Okay, and then this is all I really need. So I copy this, and I'm going to paste that right there. Now notice this URL is not 100% there. So you see this needs to be replaced with a username that's on my account. So cheese, and then I need to replace this. And again, I don't want to keep those angle brackets, so this would be the password cheese. So basically the way this reads is that this is the type of protocol. So it's a MongoDB server protocol. This is the username and password for the database on this machine. So this is like the host. That basically where, like, in the same way Google.com is the host of Google. Okay, and then after the slash, like right here between after the slash and before the question mark, I can put a database name, and I'll connect specifically to that database. We'll call this sodas app. Okay, and then this is just a little configuration. You don't have to play around with this, but these are just some configs being sent over to the database that configures the connection. Okay, and then that's that. Okay, now before we go any further, let's get connected. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make some folders. So, because we're gonna do the whole MVC thing. So I'm gonna make dir. I'm gonna make folders. Models, controllers, views. Any other folders I want to make? I think that's fine. And generally anything regarding my like database connectivity, I'm gonna do in the models folder. Sometimes you might create a separate folder called DB or connection. Again, different places do it differently, but I am going to do it in models. So in models, I'm going to create a file called connection.js. Okay, and what I'm going to do is this is going to be the file that actually like connects to Mongo. So what we'll do is we'll import Mongo. So const mongoose, because we installed Mongoose, which is a JavaScript library that allows us to interact with Mongo databases. Okay, mongoose equals require mongoose. Okay, so we import mongoose. We also need our .env variables. So require .env.config. Okay, so again, this is going to get .env vars. This imports mongoose. Then we're going to want to establish our connection, which is pretty straightforward. It's just this function mongoose.connect, and then we just pass it the URL. And again, all of our .env variables are in this object called process.env. So it would be process.env.database URL. Why is it database URL? Because that's what I called it inside the .env file. Okay, cool. I do that. Now we generally want messages to show up when the connection starts, so that way we know that the connection happened. So we're going to want to do some connection events. So what happens is that there's a variable in the Mongoose object called connection. It's essentially this like event emitter that emits events regarding the connection, like when the connection turns on, when the connection turns off. And you can create functions that run when those events occur using the on function. So mongoose.connection.on. Then you say which event, which I want to listen for the open event, meaning the connection is open. And then the second argument is the function you want to run when the connection is open, which in this case I just want to console.log connected to Mongo. Okay. then dot open, dot close, dot error. So these are the events I want to listen for. So when it is closed, the connection, I want to write disconnected from Mongo. And when it is an error, that one is going to receive the error, and then I just really just want to console log that error. So I see it in the console. And then that's it. Then we export the Mongoose object. Module.exports equals Mongoose. Then that's it. There's my connection file. This file essentially is going to export a version of the Mongoose object that has already an established connection. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my package.json. I want to just test out the connection before we go any further. Okay, so I'm going to create another script called like testdb. And all this script is going to do is just going to run node models slash connection.js. Because again, these scripts run in the context of the folder where the package.json is. So technically, I'm running the file that's going to be in the models folder that's called connection.js. So now let me run that. npm run testdb. And yeah, it works. We connect it to Mongo. Okay, so I see that it does connect to Mongo because that connection message popped up. Because again, we had that listener. We said, hey, when the connection opens, console log connect to Mongo. So that works. Good. Okay, so I'm going to stop that, and that's going to be the end of this first video. We'll get onto the Express side of things in the next video. But we now know we have a working Mongo connection. I will see you in the next video.